Hello, my name is Julia Sass-Rubin, and along with Ryan Good and Michelle Fine, I am one of the authors of Parental Action and Neoliberal Education Reform, Crafting a Research Agenda. Today, I'll be focusing on the parental action and neoliberal education reform aspects of this article. What do we mean by neoliberal education reform? As defined by David Harvey, neoliberalism is a theory of political and economic practices that posits that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Under neoliberalism, the state's role shifts from a guardian of equity and the public interest into a maker and guardian of markets. In education, neoliberalism promotes policies that advance markets, privatization, and competition through the mechanism of parental school choice, the individualized decisions that parents make regarding the schools in which they will enroll their children. The theory of neoliberal education reform is based on the assumption that the competition of parents choosing schools will drive those schools not chosen to improve their performance. And performance in this context is measured by the standardized test scores of the students. Neoliberalism changes the role of parents. Rather than parents as citizens who are advocating for benefits to the many, for example, equitable school funding, smaller class sizes, desegregation, parents are seen primarily as or solely as consumers, advocating for optimal outcomes for their own children amid what is assumed to be a limited pool of good schools. These neoliberal ideas, although rarely explicitly stated, are the basis for most of the education reform proposals that have been put forward since the 1983 publication of the report, A Nation at Risk. There has been an expansion of neoliberal education reform policy at both the federal and the state level. At the federal level, the 2001 passage of the No Child Left Behind legislation under the George W. Bush administration brought in the era of using high-stakes standardized tests to evaluate, reward, and punish students, teachers, and schools. The legislation included punitive aspects, such as forcing schools to close, convert to charter schools, or fire teachers and staff if they did not reach the standardized test score benchmarks. The Obama administration's 2010 Race to the Top initiative continued the federal emphasis on neoliberal education policies by forcing states to adopt a number of such policies in order to compete for $4.35 billion in federal funding. These policies included evaluating, rewarding, and punishing teachers and principals based on student standardized test scores, aggressively intervening in schools that had low test scores, lifting state caps on the number of charter schools to allow for their rapid expansion, and adopting common state standards. Race to the Top led 33 state legislatures to change their laws to enable these neoliberal education policies in order to have a chance to obtain federal funding that was so desperately needed on the heels of the Great Recession. The growth of neoliberal education reform was further exacerbated by the 2010 election, which shifted control of the US Congress and of many state legislatures to the Republicans, who controlled both chambers in 25 state legislatures and 32 governorships following that election. This led to the adoption of new voucher programs and to more states passing legislation authorizing the creation of charter schools. Over the last decade, the bipartisan political support for neoliberal education reform has made its ascendancy seem inevitable. However, the neoliberal conception of public schools and the individualistic role of parents that it involves has not gone unchallenged. Parents have mobilized to demand systemic change triggered by specific education reforms, such as removing public schools from local democratic control, for-profit management of public schools, charter school expansions, forced school closings, and the expansion of high-stakes standardized testing. Community resistance to neoliberal education reform is evident as far back as at least the early 1990s, when the Baltimore School District hired Education Alternatives Incorporated, a for-profit firm, to manage 9 of its public schools. There was broad community resistance, and the contract was soon terminated. In 2001, a coalition of local parent groups, the New York City Teachers Union, and the New York chapter of the community organizing group ACORN worked together to stop the city from converting 5 public schools into charter schools and turning their control over to a for-profit school management corporation. Similar resistance took place in Philadelphia around the same time, when that district turned management of a number of public schools over to the for-profit Edison Corporation. School closings have been particularly catalyzing events. Lippman observed that Chicago Mayor Richard Daley's 2004 launch of Renaissance 2010, a dramatic plan to make school closings and privatization the centerpiece of Chicago Public Schools reform agenda, was the spark that ignited a grassroots opposition movement. Led by a coalition of Black and Latinx community organizations, teacher and parent groups, students, and later the Chicago Teachers Union. Similarly, Simon, Quinn, Golden, and Cohen found that the December 2012 announcement by Philadelphia Superintendent William Haidt of a proposed closing of approximately 1/6 of district-managed public schools re-energized activism among Philadelphia's existing community and parent groups, galvanizing them to challenge the predominant narrative that market reform and extreme austerity for public schools was the only route forward. Newark's parent and community members also mobilized in response to Superintendent Cami Anderson's 2011 plan to close local public schools as part of a broader neoliberal reform initiative. School closings are not inherently neoliberal. However, they play an important role in neoliberal education theory, which posits that as parents choose schools, whether district, charter, or private, the schools not selected will be forced to downsize and close, just like a restaurant or a store that could not attract enough customers. In reality, however, communities are reluctant to close their public schools, which serve many purposes beyond educating students. Parental organizing has contested the disproportionate adverse impact of neoliberal education reform on low-income communities of color, and has advocated for educational investment and innovation in these very communities. For example, the role of race and class is prominent in efforts by parents, students, and teachers of color to stop the wholesale replacement of New Orleans public schools with charter schools. In describing the impetus for this resistance, Dixon et al. Note the overwhelming whiteness of the education reform movement in New Orleans, in which Black teachers and administrators have been displaced and replaced by a younger and whiter teaching force, and a majority of the decision makers and policymakers are also white. Good found that low-income parents of color anticipated the disparate impact that the 2013 Philadelphia school closings would have on their communities, and actively invoked the spatiality of race and class inequality in their protests. Glazier and Egan concluded the community opposition to the state-run Tennessee Achievement School District reflects perceptions of it as part of a legacy of white oppression of African Americans. Lippman highlights that the Chicago public schools that were closed were places of African American cultural and intellectual achievements, reflecting a struggle for racial justice by parents and community members going back to the early 1960s. Connecting neoliberal education reform and anti-Black state violence, Lippman recounts the 34-day hunger strike that 12 African American parents, grandparents, teachers, and supporters waged in 2015 to reopen and transform Dyett High School, the last public high school in the community. The hunger strike became both a demonstration of Black parents' determination to fight for quality public education as they envisioned it, and a display of the state's apparent disregard for Black parents and children. Even as hunger strikers grew weaker and several were hospitalized, city officials did nothing, although doctors and nurses pleaded with the mayor to intervene in a life-threatening situation. At a press conference announcing the end of the hunger strike, a mother on hunger strike said, "It's been very disappointing that the mayor of Chicago will allow us to die, even though we knew that he would do that because he's allowed Black children in our streets to die every day." While communities of color were aware of the disparate negative impact and resisted neoliberal education reforms, they were not always able to stop it. Lippman describes the inability of Chicago residents to influence their appointed Board of Education, despite candlelight vigils, pickets, rallies, sleepouts in front of the Board of Education in winter, press conferences, public testimonials, tears and outrage, and data that countered a narrative of failure. The appointed Chicago Board of Education mostly rubber-stamped the mayor's annual list of schools to be closed. This is not surprising, because Chicago, just like Philadelphia and Newark school closings, were all implemented through mechanisms of political disenfranchisement, with state power used to create and support markets, even in the face of strong popular resistance. In each of these school closing scenarios, parental mobilization came up against the lack of democratic governance, imposed through mechanisms such as state control of school districts and the replacement of elected school boards with appointed ones. This has become a feature of neoliberal education reform. To neutralize the resistance to school closings and other unpopular measures, neoliberal reformers have increasingly turned to state laws that allow school districts or individual schools to be removed from local democratic control and replaced with appointed boards or state managers. And, of course, urban communities of color have been the most frequent targets of such tactics. Morell found that state takeovers of school districts disproportionately affect Black communities with higher levels of political empowerment. Connecting the growth of such governance mechanisms to the rise of conservative, Republican-dominated politics at the state level, Morell argued that the takeovers are motivated by political power and control of resources in response to Black political empowerment in U.S. cities. Although parents and other community members have not always been able to stop the school closings and the forced charter conversions in Chicago and in other cities, their organizing still has had multiple positive effects. In Philadelphia and Newark, for example, the protest of school closings contributed to the election of pro-public education mayors and the subsequent return of local control of city school boards. In Chicago, the grassroots coalition of Black and Latinx community organizations and parent and teacher groups that fought the school closings became the foundation for subsequent organizing campaigns. This included the takeover of the Chicago Teachers Union by the Progressive Caucus of Rank-and-File Educators, and 2 citywide advisory referenda for an elected school board that won with nearly 90% approval, put the mayor on the defensive, and launched a drive for state legislation mandated an elected representative school board for Chicago. In Tennessee, growing community opposition to the state-imposed conversion of local public schools to charter schools resulted in the creation of neighborhood advisory councils, at least half of whose seats must go to parents, and which have the power to decide if a local public school is converted to a charter school. Over the last decade, as the scale of neoliberal education reform has increased and moved beyond low-income communities of color to more middle-class and white communities, parental mobilization has likewise expanded. Parents have engaged with a broad range of other coalitions and have organized across urban, suburban, racial, class, and ideological divides. For example, Lippman describes how the Chicago Parental Coalition broadened as the budget cuts instituted by the mayorally controlled public schools following the financial crisis of 2008 helped bring white middle-class families into conflict with Chicago public schools, face-to-face with an imperious school board, and in contact with Black and Latinx parents whose neighborhood schools had been perpetually under-resourced and were threatened with closure. Rubin details the creation of the statewide grassroots organization, Save Our Schools New Jersey, by upper-middle-class suburban parents who were motivated by their opposition to the neoliberal education agenda of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. In growing the organization, the more privileged founding parents reached out to parents in high-poverty communities across the state to ensure that Save Our Schools New Jersey included them and represented the issues that their schools faced. Perhaps the largest and most diverse parental mobilization to date is the movement to opt out of standardized testing. Kamenetz traces parental opt-out to May 2001, when shortly after passage of federal No Child Left Behind legislation enshrined the requirement of annual high-stakes standardized testing for all students in grades 3 to 8, parents at Scarsdale, New York Middle School organized a test boycott. One of the parents pointed out that many students do not perform well on standardized tests. These kinds of tests reduce content, they reduce imagination, they limit complex curriculum, and they add stress and cost money. Parental opposition to high-stakes standardized testing grew slowly over the subsequent decade, but exploded during the 2014-2015 academic year, following the widespread adoption of a new generation of Common Core aligned tests developed by the PARCC and Smarter Balance Testing Consortia with funding from the U.S. Department of Education. During the 14-15 academic year, more than 650,000 students across the country took part in the opt-out movement. The PARCC and Smarter Balance tests were more difficult and time-consuming than their predecessors, and they had to be administered online, leading to increased costs for computers and internet capacity, and to concerns about equity for low-income students who had limited access and experience with computers. Both conservative and liberal parents in communities of diverse sizes and geographies have taken part in resistance to standardized testing. Some are driven by objections to the Common Core standards, and others to the tests themselves and their impact on students, teachers, and public schools. Parents also obtained information from regional and national coalitions, such as Parents Across America, and a national network of education bloggers that formed in opposition to neoliberal education reform. Parents Across America was launched in early 2011 by 14 public education advocates from across the country. By 2018, the organization had 46 chapters and affiliates in 26 states. In 2013, educator and blogger Anthony Cody and education historian Diane Ravitch, who had become a leader of the movement against neoliberal education reform, founded the nonprofit organization, the Network for Public Education. Network for Public Education, or NPE as it is known, is a national advocacy group working to connect parents, students, teachers, and citizens who are passionate about our schools, and to share information and research to help public education at a time when it is under attack. By 2017, NPE's national membership had swelled to more than 350,000, driven by its online campaign to convince the U.S. Senate to reject President Trump's nomination of Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. Local, regional, and national parental mobilizations have used social media, particularly Facebook, to reach across distances and busy schedules to access policy information, networks, and organizing ideas. For example, Gay Edelman, the founder of Save Our Schools Kentucky, modeled that organization on Save Our Schools New Jersey, which she had learned about via Facebook. In 2012, Diane Ravitch launched an education policy blog that she uses to share information and to embolden many people to speak out. Within 5 years, her blog had reached 30 million views. Ravitch's blog also broadens the reach of the more than 200 education reporters, advocacy journalists, investigative bloggers, and commentators who constitute the Education Bloggers Network. Formed in 2013, the network works closely with Progressive Magazine and with the NPE organization to reach and inform a greater number of public education supporters. The impact of bloggers and progressive media outlets is to help parents counter what they see as mainstream media's generally conservative approach to education reform, as well as the overall decline in mainstream media outlets and their impact. Social media also can help parents, teachers, and community members counter the financial strength of neoliberal education reformers with the greater numbers of those who support public education. In this paper, we've highlighted that despite neoliberal education policy's efforts to limit the role of individual parents to that of consumers, that has not been the reality. Instead, parents have participated in a wide and diverse array of engaged and collective actions, many of which have challenged the expansion of neoliberal education policies, particularly in the realms of privatization, charter school expansion, school closures, and high-stakes testing.